The mountain wind howled through the pines as Amy Gray pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her heart hammering against her ribs. 20 yards away, James Turner stood facing down three men with guns drawn, his broad shoulders squared against the threat, his weathered hands steady at his sides. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and she could see the tension in every line of his body as he spoke in that low, measured voice she had come to know so well. "You boys are on my land," James said, his words carrying across the distance with quiet authority. "I suggest you move along before this gets unpleasant." The leader of the three men, a wiry fellow with cruel eyes, laughed harshly. "Your land. We got papers that say different, Turner. This whole valley belongs to the railroad now, and they sent us to make sure you understand that." Amy's fingers dug into the bark behind her. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman, stepping off a train in a dusty frontier town, clutching a worn carpet bag and a letter from a man she had never met. Now, watching the only person who had ever truly seen her, worth facing down armed men, she felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Papers can be forged," James replied, taking a deliberate step forward. "But a man's word, given in good faith, that means something out here. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring, and Amy knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would change everything. But to understand how they had reached this precipice, how a practical arrangement between strangers had become something worth fighting for, the story must begin 6 months earlier, with a woman's desperate gamble and a mountain man's reluctant hope. The train's whistle echoed off the canyon walls as it pulled into Copper Falls Station, belching steam and cinders into the crisp October air. Amy Gray smoothed her worn blue dress with trembling hands and gathered her courage along with her meager belongings. Through the grimy window, she could see the small cluster of buildings that would be her new home, if the man waiting for her proved to be what his letters had promised. She had answered James Turner's advertisement in the Denver paper out of sheer desperation. "Practical man seeks practical wife for mountain homestead. Must be willing to work hard and ask few questions. Correspondence welcome." The words had seemed harsh when she first read them, but after 3 months of searching for employment in a city that had no use for a woman, with no family and no references, practical had sounded like salvation. Their letters had been brief and businesslike. He had told her about his cabin, his small herd of cattle, the challenges of mountain living. She had told him about her skills in cooking, sewing, and managing a household, carefully omitting the circumstances that had left her alone and desperate. Neither had mentioned love or affection. This was an arrangement, nothing more. As the train shuddered to a halt, Amy caught her reflection in the window. At 26, she was past the first bloom of youth, but her mirror had always shown her a pleasant enough face, with dark hair and gray eyes that her mother had once called striking. Whether James Turner would find her acceptable remained to be seen. She stepped onto the platform with her carpet bag in one hand and her sewing box in the other, scanning the small crowd for a man who matched the description in his letters. Tall, he had written, with dark hair and a beard, usually wearing a brown coat and black hat. She spotted him immediately, standing apart from the others with the stillness of someone accustomed to solitude. James Turner was indeed tall, perhaps 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical work. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and his beard was neatly trimmed. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a deep brown that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He looked older than his 32 years, weathered by sun and wind and whatever hardships had brought him to seek a wife through the mail. When their gazes met across the platform, he removed his hat and approached with measured steps. "Miss Gray? Mr. Turner." She inclined her head, fighting the urge to smooth her dress again. "Thank you for meeting me." He studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered what he was thinking. Did she meet his expectations? Was he disappointed by what he saw? His expression remained unreadable as he reached for her carpet bag. "The wagon's this way," he said simply. "It's a 2-hour ride to the cabin." As they walked through the small town, Amy tried to take in her surroundings. Copper Falls was little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, and a few houses. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks already touched with snow despite the relatively mild weather in the valley. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, and she could understand why a man might choose to make his home in such a place. James helped her into the wagon with careful courtesy, then climbed up beside her. The seat was narrow, and she was acutely aware of his presence as he took up the reins. He smelled of pine and leather, and something else she couldn't identify, something distinctly masculine that made her pulse quicken despite herself. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the dirt road. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with unspoken questions and uncertainties. "The cabin's small," James said finally, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "2 rooms and a loft. I built it myself 5 years ago when I first came to the valley." "It sounds perfectly adequate," Amy replied, though she wondered where exactly she would sleep. They had not discussed such practical matters in their letters, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thought. "There's a creek nearby for water and good pasture for the cattle. The winters are hard, but we'll have plenty of wood for the fire and food laid by." He glanced at her briefly. "You understand what you're agreeing to, Miss Gray? This isn't an easy life." She met his gaze steadily. "I understand, Mr. Turner. I'm not afraid of hard work." Something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps, or relief. "Good. That's good." The road wound higher into the mountains, following a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and cooler, and Amy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The landscape was magnificent but intimidating, all towering pines and rocky outcroppings that seemed to dwarf human concerns. "What brought you to Colorado?" she asked, partly out of curiosity and partly to break the silence that had settled over them again. James was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Seemed like a good place to start over." The words carried weight, suggesting a story he wasn't ready to share. Amy understood the desire to leave the past behind. She had her own reasons for seeking a new beginning in this remote valley. She didn't press for details. "And you?" he asked. "What brought you to answer my advertisement?" She had prepared for this question, but sitting beside him in the growing intimacy of the wagon, the rehearsed words felt inadequate. "Circumstances," she said finally. "I found myself in need of a new situation." He nodded as if this explained everything, and perhaps for him it did. They were both refugees from whatever had come before, seeking something different in this harsh but honest land. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was indeed small, built of logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney from which smoke was already rising. A barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, and she could see cattle grazing in a fenced pasture beyond. "It's lovely," Amy said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the neat, practical arrangement of buildings, the way everything seemed to fit naturally into the landscape. James pulled the wagon up to the front door and climbed down, then came around to help her. His hands were strong and calloused as he lifted her down, and she caught another whiff of that distinctly masculine scent that made her stomach flutter in a way she didn't entirely understand. Inside, the cabin was as sparse as she had expected, but scrupulously clean. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few basic furnishings. She could see into the second room, which held a bed, a washstand, and little else. A ladder led to the loft above. "I'll sleep in the loft," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "You can have the bedroom." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by something that might have been disappointment. She pushed the confusing emotion aside and focused on the practical matters at hand. "Thank you," she said. "That's very considerate." He set her carpet bag and sewing box on the table and stood awkwardly in the center of the room, as if unsure what to do next. "There's coffee on the stove," he offered, "and I've got some beans and cornbread for supper." "I could cook," Amy said quickly. "If you'd like. I mean, that's part of why I'm here, isn't it? If you're not too tired from the journey." She wasn't tired exactly, but she was overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. Here she was, in a remote cabin with a man she had met only hours ago, preparing to share a life with him based on nothing more than a few letters and a mutual need for companionship. It was either the most practical decision she had ever made or the most foolish. "I'm fine," she said, moving toward the small kitchen area. "Why don't you show me where things are?" For the next hour, they moved around each other with careful politeness as she prepared their first meal together. James proved surprisingly helpful, anticipating her needs and quietly providing whatever she required. He was not a talkative man, but his actions spoke of consideration and an ingrained courtesy that put her somewhat at ease. As they sat down to eat, Amy was acutely aware of the significance of the moment. This was the beginning of whatever their life together would become, and she found herself studying his face in the lamplight, trying to read the man behind the careful reserve. "The food's good," James said after a few bites. "Thank you. You're welcome." She hesitated, then decided to voice what had been troubling her. "Mr. Turner, I feel I should be honest with you about something." His fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw wariness flicker in his eyes. "What's that?" "I've never been married before. I don't know if you assumed. That is, I'm not sure I know how to be a proper wife." The admission hung between them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks again. But James simply nodded as if this was not unexpected news. "I've never been married either," he said quietly. "I suppose we'll figure it out as we go." The first weeks of their arrangement unfolded with a careful rhythm that surprised Amy with its comfort. James rose before dawn to tend to the cattle and the other outdoor chores, while she managed the household tasks and prepared their meals. They spoke little during the day, but their conversations over breakfast and supper gradually grew longer and more natural. She learned that James had been a soldier in the war, though he never spoke of those years in detail. He had come west afterward, drifting from job to job until he found this valley and decided to make it his home. He was a man of few words but many skills, capable of fixing anything that broke and building whatever they needed. Amy found herself settling into the routine more easily than she had expected. The work was hard but satisfying, and there was something deeply appealing about the self-sufficiency of their life. She had never lived so close to the natural world, and she discovered a peace in the rhythm of the seasons that she had never known in the city. James proved to be a considerate companion, if not exactly warm. He was unfailingly polite, helped with the heavier household tasks without being asked, and never made her feel like an intruder in his carefully ordered world. But there was a distance between them that she couldn't quite bridge, as if he held part of himself in reserve. One evening in November, as they sat by the fire after supper, Amy decided to risk a more personal question. "Do you ever regret placing that advertisement?" James looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression thoughtful. "Do you regret answering it?" "I asked first," she said with a small smile. He was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across his weathered features. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. You've made this place feel more like a home." The simple words warmed her more than she had expected. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I was afraid I might disappoint you." "You haven't." He returned to his work, but she caught something in his tone that made her pulse quicken. "You're stronger than I expected. This life isn't easy for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," she said, then felt her cheeks warm at the implications of her words. James looked at her again, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes that made her breath catch. But then he returned his attention to the harness, and the moment passed. As winter deepened, they were thrown together more by necessity. The snow fell heavily, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. Amy discovered that James was an excellent storyteller when the mood struck him, with a dry sense of humor that surprised her. He had read widely despite his practical nature, and their evening conversations ranged from books to philosophy to their observations about the world around them. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the careful distance between them began to diminish. James started lingering over breakfast instead of hurrying out to his chores. Amy found excuses to work near him when he was repairing something in the cabin. Their hands would brush when passing dishes at meals, and neither would pull away immediately. One particularly cold night in January, Amy woke to the sound of James moving around downstairs. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the quiet sounds of him building up the fire, and felt a longing she had never experienced before. Not just for physical closeness, but for the right to comfort him, to share whatever burden had driven him from his bed in the small hours of the night. The next morning, she noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "Bad dreams?" she asked gently as she set his coffee before him. He looked startled, as if he hadn't expected her to notice. "Sometimes," he admitted. "The war mostly. It's been years, but sometimes it comes back." "Would it help to talk about it?" James shook his head. "Not much point in dwelling on what's past." But that evening, as they sat by the fire, he began to speak in halting sentences about the battles he had seen, the friends he had lost, the weight of memories he carried. Amy listened without judgment, occasionally asking a quiet question or offering a word of understanding. When he finally fell silent, she reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. He turned his hand palm up and briefly clasped her fingers. "Thank you for listening." It was a small gesture, but it felt like a door opening between them. Spring arrived late in the mountains, but when it came, it transformed the valley into something magical. The snow melted to reveal tender green grass, wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the creek ran high and clear with snowmelt. Amy felt her spirits lift with the warming weather, and she noticed a corresponding change in James. He smiled more often now, and sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When she worked in the small garden she had planted behind the cabin, he would find reasons to linger nearby. When she hung laundry on the line, he would appear to help her with the heavier items. One afternoon in May, as Amy was gathering eggs from the henhouse, she heard the sound of approaching horses. James emerged from the barn, his face immediately alert and wary. 3 men rode into the clearing, their clothes dusty from travel, and their manner suggesting they were not social callers. The leader was a thin man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth. He dismounted and approached James with a swagger that made Amy's skin crawl. "You Turner?" "I am." James's voice was carefully neutral, but Amy could see the tension in his posture. "What can I do for you?" "Name's Nathan Castillo. I represent the Colorado Mountain Railroad Company. We're surveying for a new line through this valley, and we'll be needing to purchase your land." "This land's not for sale," James said flatly. Castillo's smile was unpleasant. "Everything's for sale, Turner. It's just a matter of price. The railroad's prepared to make you a fair offer." "I said it's not for sale." One of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with small, mean eyes, spat into the dirt. "Maybe you didn't hear right, Mountain Man. The railroad wants this land. They're gonna get it one way or another." Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard stories about the railroad companies and their methods of acquiring land. Fair dealing was not always part of their approach. James stepped forward, and Amy saw his hands move slightly away from his sides. "I heard just fine. Now I suggest you gentlemen move along before this conversation takes an unpleasant turn." Castillo laughed harshly. "You're outnumbered, Turner. 3-1 ain't good odds." "Depends on the 3, James said quietly, and something in his voice made all 3 men take a step back. The tension stretched taut for a long moment. Then Castillo remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Turner. The railroad gets what it wants and we'll be back. Next time, we might not be so polite." As the 3 men rode away, Amy hurried to James's side. "Who were they? What did they want?" "Trouble," James said grimly. "The railroad's been buying up land all through the territory. They use whatever methods they have to." "But surely they can't just take your land?" James's expression was grim. "They can if they want it badly enough. The law doesn't always reach this far into the mountains, and the railroad has money and influence." That night as they sat by the fire, James was quieter than usual. Amy could see the worry in his eyes, the way his gaze kept drifting to the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "What will you do?" she asked finally. "Fight if I have to." He looked at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Amy, if things get bad, if those men come back with more force, I want you to promise me you'll go back to town. Stay with the preacher and his wife until it's safe." The thought of leaving him to face whatever was coming alone made her chest tight with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. I won't leave you. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. The words surprised her with their vehemence. This is my home too now. My life. I won't run away and leave you to face it alone. James stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Amy, he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. What is it? He rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, then knelt beside her. I need to tell you something. This arrangement we made, this practical marriage, it's become something more for me. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as just a convenient partner and started thinking of you as my wife, my real wife. Amy's heart began to race. James, I love you, he said simply. I know that wasn't part of our agreement, and I don't expect you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know. If something happens to me, I needed you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. The words hung between them in the firelit room, and Amy felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. She looked into James's brown eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. The love and longing she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. Oh, James, she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. I love you too. I think I've loved you for months, but I was afraid to hope that you might feel the same way. He caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, his eyes closing briefly as if in relief. I was afraid I was just a convenience to you, a way to escape whatever brought you here. You were never just a convenience, she said firmly. You're the kindest, strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. When I answered your advertisement, I was looking for security, but I found so much more. James rose and drew her up with him, his hands gentle on her arms. Amy, I want to ask you properly. Will you marry me? Not as a practical arrangement, but as a real marriage between two people who love each other? We're already married, she said with a soft laugh. Not in the way that matters. Not in our hearts. She looked into his eyes and saw her future there. Not the uncertain arrangement she had agreed to months ago, but a real partnership built on love and trust and mutual respect. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you in every way that matters. He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded in kind. It was their first real kiss, and it sealed something between them that had been building for months. When they finally broke apart, Amy felt as if she were glowing from within. I want to do this right, James said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to take you to town, have the preacher marry us properly, with witnesses and everything legal. What about the railroad men? What if they come back while we're gone? Then we'll face whatever comes together, he said firmly, as husband and wife. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and they set out for Copper Falls with a sense of anticipation that made even the threat hanging over them seem less ominous. Amy wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and James had trimmed his beard and put on his good shirt. The preacher, Lionel Campbell, was delighted to perform the ceremony, and his wife Joyce fussed over Amy as if she were her own daughter. The general store owner, Peter Morgan, and his wife Karen Miller served as witnesses, and soon Amy found herself standing before the altar in the small church, promising to love, honor, and cherish the man beside her. When James slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Amy felt tears of happiness blur her vision. This was what she had never dared to dream of when she stepped off that train 6 months ago. A real marriage based on love and respect and genuine partnership. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Campbell said with a smile. And James did, thoroughly and with a tenderness that made Amy's knees weak. They spent their wedding night at the small hotel in town, and Amy discovered that the physical side of marriage was every bit as wonderful as the emotional connection they had built. James was gentle and patient, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. The next morning, they lingered over breakfast at the hotel, reluctant to return to the uncertainty waiting for them at the cabin. But eventually duty called, and they loaded their supplies into the wagon for the journey home. As they drove through the valley, Amy noticed that James was more alert than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. She felt a prickle of unease when she saw how his hand rested near the rifle he always carried in the wagon. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "I know they will," James said grimly. "Men like that don't give up easily, and the railroad has too much money invested in this route to let one stubborn homesteader stand in their way. What will we do?" "We'll be ready for them," he said simply, "and we'll protect what's ours." The cabin appeared around the familiar bend, looking peaceful and welcoming in the afternoon sunlight. But as they approached, Amy noticed that something was wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, and there were strange marks in the dirt near the porch. James pulled the wagon to a halt and reached for his rifle. "Stay here," he said quietly. But Amy had already seen what he had seen. The cabin had been searched, their belongings scattered and broken. Flour had been dumped on the floor, dishes smashed, and furniture overturned. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. "They were here," Amy said, her voice tight with anger. "They went through our things." James's face was grim as he surveyed the damage. "They're trying to scare us into leaving." "Are you scared?" Amy asked, though she could see the answer in his steady gaze. "No," he said simply. "Are you?" Amy looked around at the destruction of their home, the violation of their private space, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This was her home, her life, her marriage. No one had the right to destroy it. "No," she said firmly. "I'm angry." They spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and assessing the damage. Most of their belongings could be repaired or replaced, but the violation felt personal and deliberate. Amy found herself growing angrier as the day wore on, not just at the destruction, but at the arrogance of men who thought they could intimidate people into abandoning their homes. That evening, as they sat by the fire, James outlined his plan. "They'll be back, probably with more men. When they come, I want you to be ready to get to safety. I told you before, I'm not leaving you. Amy, be reasonable. I can handle myself, but I can't fight and worry about protecting you at the same time." She stood up and faced him, her hands on her hips. "James Turner, I didn't marry you yesterday just to become a widow today. If you think I'm going to hide while you face those men alone, you don't know me very well." "I know you're brave," he said patiently, "but bravery and foolishness are two different things." "Then teach me," she said suddenly. "Teach me to shoot. Teach me to fight. If we're going to face this together, I need to be able to defend myself and help defend you." James stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No arguing, no hesitation." "Agreed." For the next week, James taught Amy to handle a rifle and a pistol. She proved to be a surprisingly good shot, with steady hands and sharp eyes. More importantly, she showed no fear of the weapons or squeamishness about what they might be used for. "You're a natural," James said one afternoon, as Amy hit the target he had set up near the barn. "Where did you learn to focus like that?" "Necessity," Amy said simply, echoing his own words from months ago. "I've learned that when you really need to do something, you find a way to do it." They also worked on strategy, identifying the best defensive positions around the cabin and planning how they would respond to different types of attacks. James showed her how to move quietly through the woods, how to use cover effectively, and how to watch for signs of approaching danger. "The key is to make them think twice," he explained. "If we can make it costly enough for them, they might decide it's easier to find another route for their railroad." Amy nodded, but privately she doubted it would be that simple. She had seen the look in Nathan Castillo's eyes, the casual cruelty that suggested he would enjoy the violence as much as the victory. 2 weeks after the break-in, Amy was hanging laundry when she heard the sound she had been dreading. Horses moving fast up the valley road. She dropped the shirt she was holding and ran toward the cabin, where James was already emerging with his rifle. "How many are?" he asked tersely. Amy counted quickly. 6, maybe 7. James cursed under his breath. They had prepared for 3 or 4 men, but 7 was more than they had anticipated. "Get inside and take your position by the back window. Remember what we practiced." Amy nodded and hurried into the cabin, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She took up the rifle James had given her and positioned herself where she could cover the back of the cabin while still seeing most of the front yard. The riders approached at a gallop, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. Amy recognized Nathan Castillo in the lead, but the others were strangers, hard-looking men with the appearance of hired guns rather than railroad surveyors. They pulled up in front of the cabin in a show of force clearly meant to intimidate. Castillo dismounted and swaggered toward the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Turner," he called, "time to be reasonable. We've got a generous offer from the railroad, and I'd hate to see you pass it up." James stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "I told you before, Castillo. This land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale," Castillo replied, his voice hardening. "Question is whether you're going to take the money or take the consequences." "Is that a threat?" Castillo's smile was cold. "It's a fact. The railroad's going to build through this valley whether you cooperate or not. You can take the money and start over somewhere else, or you can be buried here. Your choice." From her position by the window, Amy could see two of the men moving to flank the cabin. She shifted her rifle to track their movement, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Everything James had taught her about patience and timing came back to her as she waited for the right moment. "I've made my choice," James said quietly. "Now make yours. Ride away now, or face the consequences yourself." Castillo laughed harshly. 7-1. "Turner, even you ain't that good." 7-2, Amy called from the window, showing herself just enough for the men to see her rifle. "And I'm a very good shot." The appearance of Amy at the window clearly surprised the men, and Amy saw several of them exchange uncertain glances. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone mountain man, not to face a prepared couple defending their home. Castillo's face darkened with anger. "This is your last chance, Turner. Send the woman away and we can settle this between men." "My wife stays," James said firmly, "and you've overstayed your welcome." The word wife seemed to inflame Castillo further. "So you found yourself a woman stupid enough to die for this worthless patch of dirt? Well, if that's how she wants it." He started to draw his gun, but James was faster. His rifle cracked, and Castillo's hat flew off his head. The shot was a clear warning, accurate enough to show that the next one wouldn't miss. "The next one goes between your eyes," James said calmly. "Your move." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then one of the flanking men tried to rush the cabin from the side, and Amy's rifle spoke. The man stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder, very much alive but out of the fight. The sound of her shot seemed to break the spell, and suddenly everyone was moving. The remaining men scattered for cover, drawing their weapons as they went. James dropped behind the porch railing and began returning fire, while Amy tracked targets from her window. The battle was fierce but brief. The hired guns had expected an easy victory, not a coordinated defense from two people who knew the terrain and had prepared for exactly this scenario. Within minutes, two more men were down, and the others were retreating toward their horses. "This ain't over," Castillo shouted as he mounted up. "The railroad's got deep pockets and a long memory." "So do I," James called back, his rifle still trained on the retreating men. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Amy emerged from the cabin on shaking legs. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She had shot a man, something she had never imagined herself capable of doing. But looking at James, seeing him alive and unhurt, she felt no regret. "You did good," James said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm proud of you." "Is it over?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," he said grimly. "They'll be back with more men, and they'll be ready for us next time. We need help." That night they rode to town under cover of darkness. James sought out the sheriff, Adam Cook, a fair man who had little love for the railroad's strong-arm tactics. But Cook was also realistic about his limitations. "I can't station men up at your place permanent-like," he told them. "And if the railroad brings in enough hired guns, there's not much I can do to stop them legally." "What about the territorial governor?" Amy asked. "Surely he has authority over the railroad." Cook shook his head. "The railroad's got friends in high places, Mrs. Turner. More friends than a mountain homesteader, if you take my meaning." James's jaw tightened. "So we're on our own." "Not entirely," Cook said thoughtfully. "There's other folks in the valley who don't want the railroad coming through. Might be they'd be willing to stand with you if it came to a fight." The next day, James and Amy visited every homestead and ranch in the valley, explaining the situation and asking for support. The response was mixed. Some, like old Rachel Jackson, who ran a small cattle operation near the creek, were ready to fight. Others, like the Miller family with their young children, were too frightened to risk a confrontation with the railroad. But by the end of the week, they had commitments from 8 men and 3 women who were willing to make a stand. It wasn't an army, but it was enough to make the railroad think twice about their tactics. "We'll make our stand at your place," Rachel Jackson said during a meeting at the cabin. "It's the best defensive position in the valley, and if we can stop them there, maybe they'll decide to route their railroad somewhere else." Amy looked around at the faces of their neighbors, people who were willing to risk everything to protect their way of life, and felt a surge of fierce pride. This was what community meant, what it really meant to have a home worth fighting for. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. Amy woke to the sound of James moving quietly around the cabin, checking weapons and ammunition. Through the window, she could see the dim shapes of their allies taking positions around the property. "How many this time?" she whispered. 15, maybe 20, James replied grimly. "They brought an army." Amy felt a moment of fear, but it was quickly replaced by determination. They had prepared for this, trained for it, and they would not be driven from their home without a fight. The sun was just beginning to rise when the first shots rang out. This time, there was no attempt at negotiation or intimidation. The railroad men had come to finish the job, and they came with overwhelming force, but they had underestimated the determination of people fighting for their homes. Amy found herself moving through the battle with a clarity she had never experienced before. Each shot carefully aimed, each movement calculated for maximum effect. She was no longer the desperate woman who had stepped off a train 6 months ago, but a fierce defender of everything she held dear. James fought with the skill of a veteran soldier, his shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Together, they held the cabin while their neighbors defended the perimeter, turning what should have been an easy victory for the railroad into a costly siege. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But gradually, the superior numbers of the railroad men began to tell. One by one, their allies were forced to fall back, until only James and Amy remained in the cabin, surrounded but still defiant. "We can't hold them much longer," James said during a brief lull in the fighting. "They're going to rush us soon, and when they do, we'll be ready," Amy said firmly. "Together." James looked at her, this woman who had become the center of his world, and felt his heart swell with love and pride. "I love you, Amy Turner. Whatever happens, I want you to know that." "I love you too," she replied. "And I'm not giving up. Not on us, not on our home, not on our future." The final assault came just as the sun reached its zenith. Nathan Castillo, his face twisted with rage and frustration, led a dozen men in a desperate charge toward the cabin. Amy and James met them with everything they had, their rifles speaking in deadly harmony. But there were too many of them. As Amy reloaded her rifle, she saw Castillo break through their defense and level his gun at James. Time seemed to slow as she realized she wouldn't be able to reload in time, wouldn't be able to save the man she loved. Then a shot rang out from the trees behind the cabin, and Castillo spun around and fell. More shots followed, and suddenly the railroad men found themselves caught in a crossfire from an unexpected direction. "The cavalry's here!" shouted a familiar voice, and Amy saw Sheriff Cook emerge from the trees with a dozen deputized men, their rifles smoking. The remaining railroad men threw down their weapons and raised their hands, their will to fight broken by this unexpected reversal. In a matter of minutes, the battle was over, and the threat that had hung over the valley was ended. In the aftermath of the battle, as the wounded were tended and the prisoners secured, Amy and James stood together in front of their cabin, surveying the damage. The building was scarred by bullet holes, and their yard was torn up by the fighting, but it was still standing, still theirs. "How did you know to come?" James asked Sheriff Cook. "Got word from the territorial governor," Cook replied with a grin. "Seems someone sent him a very persuasive letter about the railroad's illegal tactics. He decided it was time to remind them that the law applies to everyone, even companies with deep pockets." Amy felt a flush of satisfaction. The letter she had written and sent without telling James had reached its target after all. Sometimes, she reflected, the pen really was mightier than the sword. "What happens now?" she asked. Now the railroad finds another route for their line, Cook said, and you folks get to live in peace. As the sheriff and his men escorted their prisoners back to town, the neighbors who had fought beside them began to drift away to their own homes. But before they left, each one stopped to shake hands with James and Amy, acknowledging them as the leaders who had made their victory possible. You did something special here, Rachel Jackson said as she prepared to leave. You showed us that we don't have to let big companies push us around. That's worth more than all the gold in Colorado. When the last of their allies had gone, James and Amy stood alone in their battered but victorious homestead. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the valley had never looked more beautiful. So, James said, slipping his arm around his wife's waist, what do you think? Was answering that advertisement worth all the trouble? Amy leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him against her side. Every bit of it, she said softly. I came here looking for security, but I found something much more valuable. What's that? I found home, she said simply. I found love. I found myself. James tightened his arm around her and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I found the same thing, he said. I placed that advertisement because I thought I needed a practical wife to help me run this place. But what I got was a partner, a companion, a woman who was willing to fight beside me for what we've built together. They stood in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The cabin would need repairs. The yard would need to be cleaned up, and there would be other challenges in the days to come. But they would face them together, as they had faced everything else. James, Amy said suddenly, do you think we'll have children someday? He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. I hope so. I'd like to think that what we've built here will last beyond us, that our children and grandchildren will call this valley home. They'll need to know the story, Amy said thoughtfully, how their parents met, how they fell in love, how they fought to protect what they built together. It's a good story, James agreed. A practical man and a practical woman who discovered that love is the most practical thing of all. As they walked hand in hand toward their battle-scarred but still standing home, Amy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman with no options and no hope. Now she was a wife, a fighter, a woman who had found her place in the world and was prepared to defend it against all comers. The advertisement in the Denver paper had promised a practical arrangement with a practical man. What she had found was so much more than that. She had found a love worth fighting for, a home worth defending, and a strength within herself that she had never known existed. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Turner homestead. The railroad, chastened by their defeat and the territorial governor's displeasure, found an alternate route through a different valley, leaving James and Amy's land in peace. Other settlers, drawn by stories of the community that had successfully stood up to corporate intimidation, began to arrive in the valley, building homes and businesses that gradually transformed the isolated region into a thriving community. Amy and James welcomed 3 children over the next 5 years, 2 sons and a daughter who grew up strong and independent in the mountain air. The boys inherited their father's quiet strength and practical nature, while their daughter showed signs of having her mother's fierce determination and sharp intelligence. The cabin was expanded and improved over the years, growing from its original 2 rooms into a comfortable family home. But Amy never forgot the simple space where she and James had first learned to love each other, and she made sure that part of the original structure remained unchanged, a reminder of where their story had begun. As the children grew older, they would often ask to hear the story of how their parents met, how their mother had answered an advertisement for a practical wife and found instead a great love. Amy would tell them about the train that brought her to Copper Falls, about their careful courtship through letters, about the gradual growth of love between 2 people who had started as strangers. But it was James who told them about the battle, about how their mother had stood beside him with a rifle in her hands, defending their home against men who would have driven them away. He spoke with quiet pride of her courage, of the way she had refused to abandon him even when the odds seemed impossible. Your mother, he would tell them, is the strongest person I've ever known. She came here thinking she was looking for security, but what she brought was strength. She made me stronger, made this place stronger. made all of us stronger. Amy would blush at these words, but she never contradicted them. She had learned to accept the truth of her own courage, to acknowledge the strength that had always been within her, but had needed the right circumstances to emerge. The valley prospered in the years following the railroad conflict. Other families, inspired by the Turners' example, came to build homes and lives in the mountain community. A school was established, then a church, then a proper town with all the amenities that growing families required. Amy became a leader in the community, her experience in standing up to the railroad earning her the respect and trust of her neighbors. She helped establish the school, served on the church board, and was often called upon to mediate disputes or provide counsel to families facing difficulties. James continued to work the land, expanding his cattle operation and becoming one of the most successful ranchers in the region. But he never forgot the lessons of those early years, the importance of community and mutual support that had made their victory possible. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Amy and James would sit on their porch and look out over the valley they had helped to build. The lights of other homes twinkled in the darkness, evidence of the community that had grown up around their original homestead. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't answered that advertisement?" Amy would sometimes ask. "No," James would reply without hesitation, "because you did answer it. You were brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, strong enough to build a life in a hard place, and fierce enough to fight for what we built together. That's who you are, Amy Turner. That's who you've always been." And Amy, looking out over the valley where their children played and their neighbors lived in peace, would know that he was right. She had found her place in the world, not by accident or luck, but by having the courage to reach for something better and the strength to hold on to it when it was threatened. The practical arrangement between a mountain man and a mail-order bride had become something neither of them had dared to dream of when they first exchanged letters. It had become a love story, a family story, a community story that would be told for generations to come. Years later, when Amy's hair had turned silver and James's beard was white, they would still sit on that porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains they had made their home. Their children, grown now with families of their own, would visit with grandchildren who played in the same yard where their grandparents had once made their stand against overwhelming odds. The advertisement that had brought them together was long forgotten, yellowed and crumbling in an old newspaper somewhere. But the love it had sparked, the community it had helped to build, and the legacy it had created would endure for as long as people remembered the value of courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what truly matters. Amy Gray had stepped off a train in a dusty frontier town with nothing but a carpetbag and a desperate hope for a better life. Amy Turner had built an empire of love, family, and community that would last for generations. The transformation had not happened overnight, but through years of hard work, mutual respect, and the kind of deep, abiding love that grows stronger with each challenge it faces. The mountain man had indeed found his practical bride, but more than that, he had found his partner, his equal, his other half. And she had found not just security or survival, but a life of meaning, purpose, and joy that exceeded her wildest dreams. In the end, it had been the most practical arrangement of all,